Will, I'm actually his boss, so Will does work for me. I don't know if you know that. I've kind of taught him everything he knows about Tableau. Some things have stuck, most things have not. So, I don't know what the quality is going to be for this presentation. I'm really happy that I'm going to go second because you'll see that he's going to set the bar so low that it's going to be so easy for me to,
Just
level up those
walk over.
expectations. So, Will, take it away, my friend.
Those are loving and caring words, Zachary. You are a gentleman and a scholar in every definition of the word. So I look forward to introducing you in the coming minutes. So uh, as Zach mentioned, he's not my boss. I do not work for him. He and I do help each other out. We do teach each other things. We share our ins and outs, just like any people in the culture do, in the Tableau community do. My favorite thing today that I'm going to talk about is actually date diff. I think date diff is a valuable and underutilized function within Tableau, and there's so many great things that you can do with it. So I'm going to talk about that and what a difference date diff makes. So quick definitions, just to make sure kind of everybody's on the same page. I know that Tableau has the specific definitions in the tool, but date diff, it returns a numerical value between a start and a stop date, defining on what that particular truncation of the date you want to do. Date trunc just brings a value to a lowest common denominator defined by that date part. Date add, you can do some mathematical stuff, right? Because a date can be categorical or continuous, depending on, you can look at it as a dimension as that particular value, or you can think about it like human beings think about dates, and it's a continuous plane. It goes forwards and backwards. Getting date name is the actual text value. Date part is a piece of that. It's very similar to date name, but it actually returns a numeric value. So April is 04. And date parse is going through and kind of like turning a string into a date, right? So I give you all of those things to show that there's many variations of how you can do date values in Tableau. So I do want to make sure you do take some mental notes. So as I go through any dashboard, when I'm thinking about it, I always try to think from a business perspective, how am I going to scale this out? Is this a one-time ask, or is this a long-term BAU type dashboard for us to continue going forward? So if I have to take dates into consideration, is there a certain time frame people generally care about? Is there a certain type of view that people care about? Should I have some sort of default value? Should I, how do I scale that out, right? Reporting timeframes at a lower granularity than months is confusing for end users. And so what do I mean by that? Well, reporting at a year level, if I'm going to do a difference between years, super easy. A year is a year. Then quarters, there's 4 quarters in a year. There's 12 months in a year. But when you get down to anything below that, not every month has exactly 4 weeks or 5 weeks. And sometimes a month starts midweek and ends at the end of the last week. And there's 365 days until there's not 365 days. You get that leap year. And then if I'm doing comparisons year over year on a date, well, what if one date was a holiday and the next year it's not, or happened on a date, right? So it gets really confusing from end user perspective, trying to explain what makes sense. And we can do things logically, numeric wise or date wise, but there's a lot of confusion. So just being cognizant of that aspect. So I touched on it earlier. Dates can be both categorical and continuous, so a dimension or a measure in Tableau. So being cognizant of what those values are and how to use them. And if you didn't have good use cases for date diff before, hopefully you see some examples today that you will have go forward. So let's kind of start here. I'm going to get out of presentation mode and just kind of start going through. So I'm using Superstore data, the data set that everybody knows and loves. And I've added an additional calculation to kind of like keep the dates dynamic. So I can show some like forward-looking dates so we can kind of explain on that and keep things current. So when I'm looking at a date trend, I'm going to speak from BAU, like business aspects, and I'm sure many of you guys will be able to relate. Sometimes you have dates that are in the forward. You're projecting out numbers. It's in your data set. You're not necessarily using Tableau's forecasting. You're using actual values that your business has created. So it's super easy, right? You can create a trend line. You throw the continuous variable up top of the dates. I'm saying I'm looking at the months of my constant date over time of sales, and I can see what is a future date and what is a back date. Super easy. Anybody can drag and drop and create this view in a few seconds. And if I'm looking at a historical trend, if I want to say I want to look at the last 13 months of data, that too is very simple to define within Tableau using a date filter, right? So I can right click, I've got my date value on the filter shelf. I'm looking at months and I'm looking at the last 13 months, and it's telling me that I've got 7/1 of 2020 to 7/31 of 2021, right? Showing my time frame, 13 months worth of data. Super easy to do in Tableau. But I can't say I also want to include some future values, right? If I want to say I want to have at least a year's worth of history from behind the scenes, and I want to look at everything that's future value, I can't really do that within Tableau unless I were to go to like range of dates. Then I start getting to the point of where I've got some hard-coded values, right? I'm putting in this slider that doesn't necessarily meet my specific expectations of what I need. I'm not a big fan of sliders. I mean, I could do start date, I could do a default end date, etc. But I want something that's a little bit more dynamic that I don't have to worry about hard coding a particular value. So let's go to this historic and date and future date, right? So if the ask is, I want to look at my prior 13 months, and I want to see everything that is future date, or maybe I want 3 months in the future, how do I really do that? So I'm gonna expand on my categories. And so let's look at the calculations for date diff. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit here. Date diff is the difference between two dates, right? It's very self-explanatory, difference of dates. And I'm looking at this at the monthly level. So I've got this parameter that I'm using as kind of like my report end date. And I'll show you kind of like what that looks like, right? So it's dynamic. It looks at today as of, every time I open this up, so it keeps it dynamic. So right now we're in July timeframe, okay? So the date difference at the month level of today to other values in the date field, I'm able to get a variable, right? And so what's going to be returned is the number of months between those two dates. So the thing that I like about date diff is it creates an anchor point where 0 will always be your most current value, right? So anywhere in this value here, 0 is going to be all values in July of 2021. Any positive number are going to be future, and any negative numbers are going to be in the past, right? So now that makes it a lot easier for me to define, well, if I have a report date of like, this is my data as of, and I'm going to have some future values in there, and have some past values in here, then I can start thinking, well, I want at least 13 months in the history, like the use case is, and 3 months in the future. So what I can do is I can take this date diff month value and I can drag it over to my filters, and I want all values, right? So if I want 13 months, current 13 months, then I'm going to do minus 12. Oops, not minus 12. So minus 12 is going to give me 13 months, current and past. And then I want 3 months in the future. So now I can hit apply, and this, I never have to worry about changing those dates. I never have to worry about changing anything on this worksheet. Again, as long as those constraints remain the same. They want a year's worth of history, and they want to look at 3 months in the future, right? So as my date value changes, right? So I've got my parameter, and I'll just do show parameter. So let's say that my data is actually updated as of end of June, right? I click June, and you'll see the line chart changed, right? So now my current month that it's showing me is as of June. I hover over this, I've got June of 2020. This is June of 2021. I've got 3 months worth of the future. So I got September, right? So it makes it a lot easier to where now I no longer have to think about this dashboard ever again when it's looking at this particular date range. So it makes it a lot easier. So when you think about date diff, like I said, looking at the variables, what it does is it creates the anchor point. So data as of, right, just kind of give you an example to look, well, if I wanted a date diff of years, I can click on this fiscal year or full year 2021. I'm truncating this to a year value. This is all of my 2021 data, 2020, 2019. I got my future 2022, right? If I go here to quarterly, looking at the quarterly. So as I said, in the past, anything negative is past, anything positive is future. You've got your point where it's a constant. And so this just gives you an ability to see where those values come through, right? So this is Q2, Q1, Q4, Q3, et cetera, right? And then you go to the months, and it makes it a lot easier for some of these ways to start kind of taking that into consideration. So I already did this. All right, so this is the I went ahead and already did all that already. So it's before going into the understanding date diff. I practiced this out of order. All right, so how do I take this into, other things, right? A trend line is good, but what are some additional things that people like to have on dashboards? Well, KPIs are huge, and KPIs with month over month, year over year comparisons are super, common when it comes to business relationships. You gotta have some sort of context with your KPIs. And generally people like month over month change, year over year change. So using date diff, I can create one worksheet with 2 additional calculations, month over month, year over year calculations, using table calcs, and I never have to think about this ever again, right? So how do I get to something like this KPI where I don't have to think about creating this? I don't have to create another process in my ETL process to define these calc percentages. I want these to remain dynamic. I want these to be impactful. So what do I do here? Well, I can easily start with saying, okay, well, I've got my dates, and we've got this by region, right? So this is just the basic information. So I'm going to drag my date diff of month up top, and I'm just going to right click and drag, and I've got my variable, and I'm just going to convert this to be discrete, just so you can kind of see those numbers. So 29 is 29 months in the past. Come over here to looking at 0, right? So we got 0 on these current values. Actually, let's drag this over here, make it easier. All right, so doing this over here. So -1, 0. All right, so here we have our current month numbers. Well, I don't need anything past a year in the past because I'm looking at, just year over year numbers, and I don't need anything in the future because I'm not projecting anything out. So I can throw my filter shelf, use all values, and I just want -12 to 0, right? Because I just want a year's worth of data, okay? So now that's filtering out my data. I've got June of 2020 to June of 2021, May, et cetera, right? So starting to look at this, super easy. Then we can do a table calculation to say, I want the difference between these numbers, right? I want to start looking and saying, okay, what's the percent difference? Well, I'm going to drag sales down here. I'm going to drag this to detail real quick because I've already got sales listed on the label, so I can't put another sum of sales on the label. It won't duplicate that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a table calculation. So I'm going to do a percent difference. I'm going to control drag, or actually I'll just drag this over here to label. And then I'm going to make sure my calculation is calculating at the level that I want it to calculate. So I want West to look at West, right? So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to take this off. Oops, wrong one. Sorry, date diff. There we go. All right, so for each month and date diff, I want the percent difference at the region level, right? So now I'm looking at region and I've got a percent change I can see 13, 13, are going off like, so this is coming from 12, right? And this is the prior month. So now I know that West, this is 74% above where it was last month, et cetera, right? So now I've got my month over month calculation. All right. So I'm going to do a quick table calculation name, or I can just drag this over here. I've already got it in the values over here, but I'll just drag this over here into my view, and I'm just going to call this month over month example. There we go. All right. Why did that not adjust? Sorry. So edit table calculation. Was that only showing for West? East, South, maybe it's a size thing. All right, we'll work on sizing here in a little bit because we saw that the numbers working. So what I'm going to do actually is take the sum of sales again, drag it up to detail, do another table calculation, percent difference again. I'm going to drag this to label, and let's fix these size or make this little fit a little bit more. Or not. Let's go here. All right, so we'll format this here in a little bit just so you can see all the different numbers. All right, so we've got percentages for all this. Now I've got my secondary sum of sales. Again, we're going to do a quick table calculate or edit the table calculation, doing it based off of, oops, we want it based on region and date, and we want it relative to the very first value. So we're going to go all the way back to negative 12. And we're going to do that comparison to say how much has changed during these times. And we'll do the same thing, drag this over here to calculation. We'll say YOY example. So now I've got a table calculation that is showing me the percent difference since, so we're looking at West. We'll just say, okay, West from, we're up 265% just to validate. We'll scroll all the way over here. It was at 5,000. Now we're at, excuse me, almost a little over 18,500. It's a pretty big jump. So yep, that passes the sniff test. And then what I want to do is I don't want to see anything else in here. I can't filter any of the prior months because then my table calculations will break. So what I want to do is I'll just put an inline calculation to say date diff month equals 0. So I'm going to get a Boolean calculation. And you can see it's false over here. And what I can do is I can just right click. Oh, because I'm on Tableau Pub. I'm on the, let me just drag this over here. Tableau Public doesn't let me hide on inline calculations. Take a note, Tableau team. Can't hide on inline calculations. So I'll just make this show only current month. All right. So now it's an actual field. Now I can go and hide any false values. So now I'm looking at these. I formatted it. Let's show all entire view. This isn't working the way that it's supposed to be. This is what happens when I do stuff on the fly. All right. Oh, it's because I need to add those into the level of granularity. Same thing, month over month, edit. There we go. I click twice. There we go. Now it's working as expected. I don't need to see this header. I don't need to see the 0. So I can just uncheck show header and I can format these accordingly. So now I can make a pretty sweet KPI where I don't have to worry about a month over month or year over year calculation ever again. So let's say like I'm gonna make this size 12, sum of sales. Let's make this size 28. That looks good. Month over month, we can say month over month here. And then year over year, year over year. And I've got some good looking KPIs, right? I can format those numbers. I can build in some colors, etc. But that is the easiest way. I do this all day long for KPIs and I never have to think about them ever again. Then I can go into some additional enhancements of how do I get some things to call out the numbers of, what's important to look at, where we're looking at all negative and month over month changes above 75% growth. I'm going to switch this back to, I'm not going to go into this, but I've got this workbook saved on my Tableau public profile. So feel free to go look at my Tableau public profile to view this. And then we can just, let's say we want to make this to July. I know that July number, oops, just make this July, hit okay. So then you've got like green and red. So like if it's really good growth, you can say, hey, this is beyond really good. Anything that's negative, you really want to focus. So this is a fun little trick that I do as well in some of my BAU business work on how to like draw the eyes to things that are important. And then we'll come down to like a trailing month over month calculation where sometimes you want a rolling 12 months counting today as 0 and I want a prior year, and just use just the 2-year trend of comparing month over month, year over year type numbers. Again, using DATEDIFF. I'm trying to be cognizant on time here. So if any of the speakers want to, or the presenters, sorry, want to show that, like if I'm good on like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on time. But now be able to do this. So now instead of a rolling months, again, going to a normalization, if I right click on here and look at the calculation, I start doing modulos. Can't really explain mathematically modulos other than saying like, we're going to divide this by 12, but get like the low value, like how many times does this number go into 12? Because I've got 12 months in a year, and I'm taking the floor of that, right? So I'm just getting the integer of that number, which gives me my rolling months. So if I have my DATEDIFF rolling months show header, then that keeps my current month again as 0. And I'm taking the modulo. So current month for prior year is still 0. It's just dragging all those numbers into the 0 versus 12, right? So the moment I get 12, that's going to bring it down to 0 as well. And then any future values. And then for rolling years to get the separate lines, I take the DATEDIFF of the months and I get the ceiling value of dividing that by 12. So it's a different way of looking at the mathematics for, how do I get, 0 being current year, 1 being prior year, 2, et cetera. So then this just gives me an ability to have this value continue to trend. And what I did is put in just a reference line to say, this is January for that current year. Like, when is January? So your end users have kind of a reference point. We're looking at the current versus prior 12 months worth of data, sum of sales, and it's showing the values from August 2019 to July 2021, and kind of gives the reference point to say, okay, well, I'm not going to show the header because a customer or an end user, business stakeholder, doesn't understand what 0 means. So I don't show that header. So now I can say, okay, well, they're looking at January, February, March, right? They can tell by where the lines are changing. That gives them a reference point, and it can tell you this is current month, right? So now you've got points of reference where I don't need a header. So it helps the end users understand their visualization they're looking at. So hopefully you learned a little bit here. I see there's a lot of like blinking on the chats for Q&A. So if we want to open it up to Q&A right now, I'm good for that.
Sure, we can do that. And there was also a question, I think we may have one in the chat. Hang on a second. Okay. If someone has a question about, would your method significantly slow down dashboards that are utilizing live connections?
I don't, like, in my BAU setting, we don't use live connections. We generally have a process that preps the data for dashboards consumption prior to it going to the server. So I don't know if that would impact performance on a live connection.
Gotcha.
I don't have a good enough answer for that. Zach's a server guy, so Zach can come off mute and say.
Yeah, you have any thoughts, Zach?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, pretty much anything that's not simply just connecting to the data is always going to hurt performance in live connections. So anything, you want to stay away from table calcs, you want to stay away from LODs, because Tableau is going to basically select everything, and then on top of that, write a function that mirrors that in SQL. So you want to be careful, especially if performance is already not great with the regular connection. This is just going to kind of add to it. But yeah, in an extract, which is most cases, this stuff is, it's nominal. It's not really going to make much of a difference.
Okay, no, that's cool. Let's see, any other questions? I'm checking Q&A. We don't have any that were submitted in there. Okay, looks like we have another one. If a dashboard has one primary data source and multiple secondary data sources, would this method for metrics am I reading this wrong? Sorry. Would this method for metrics based on secondary data sources?
So like, would this work for secondary data sources, I'm assuming?
I think so.
I mean, it would depend on how you build those relationships between those secondary data sources. Are you using a parameter versus an attribute of that primary source on the secondary source, right? I think it goes back to kind of Zach's statement earlier. Like, there's complexities that can go into this. So I don't want to get into like that technical deep dive, because I think that everyone's going to have different use cases on how they run their BAU processes. But I would just say, like the Andy Cotgreave, like, it depends.
Yeah, no, totally. Okay, one more. Is there anything unique to doing this with year-to-date calculation?
Yeah, I mean, it's just understanding the math, right? So then you would be able to say, well, what is like, if we're looking at year to date, for example, what is the zero for the beginning of the year, or like how many months forward or quarters forward, or et cetera, is just finding the difference. So then it just becomes, I don't have to think about the actual date values and filtering just January. Then you can say, okay, well, I'm X months ahead of January, and kind of do that delta, and then it's set it and forget it.
Okay, perfect. Anyone have any additional questions? I'm looking through, wait, we might have just had another one. Okay. All right, I think table calcs are hard to work with disparate data sources. Is that true?
I mean, like, using the table calc with the other data source, like, I'm not sure what you mean by the disparate data sources, other than just like having multiple data. So like, yeah. I mean, I think it would be the same as like, it's all goes down to the relationships of that you've set up between those multiple data sources. Again, I'll point to Zach from a performance perspective. Like, if you can come up with logic, you can come up with logic, and it might be a little bit more difficult. I always recommend, if you can, push as much back up the data pipeline as possible. Make Tableau do as little of the calculation work as possible. But there are things that you have to take into consideration, the dynamic aspect. Like, you may have 10 different filters on a dashboard, and if you're trying to show percentage, like, month over month change, but you've got every possible, like Superstore, you say, drill down to this region, and then go down to this state, and then go down, like, there's a million possibilities. And so if you don't want to have to think about those million possibilities somebody could do, you want to keep that dynamic aspect in Tableau. But if there are issues like linking data table, like, push that up so you can minimize the calculations between the disparate sources inside the tool.
Yeah, I feel like that's definitely been my experience as well. Like, I always seem to have better, it seems to work easier and everything's smoother if it's all in one data source, and it's just like your primary data source, everything's in there. When you do have to cross, it can get trickier, and you can get errors. So I think I know what they're saying, but it looks like we've got one more. Would this also work with level of detail calculations as well?
Yeah, I mean, it would. So level of detail calculation, you could set a different anchor point, or you can fix your levels at, whatever granularity you want to. So, I mean, it could absolutely, like, what is my max date diff and then kind of do some additional elements. But I mean, it all depends on the use case. But yeah, I mean, level of details could absolutely be used here.